Hi. So in this video, I'd like to talk about time management in CLAT. So a lot of students end up losing out on grade and lose solely because of their poor management of time. So how do you go about giving CLAT in so in this manner that you maximize the amount of time, maximize the amount of marks in the limited amount of time that you have? So the format of CLAT is 200 questions and plus one for a right answer and negative 2.25 for a wrong answer. It's a 2 hour paper, so you see you get less than 1 minute per question. Now, while 1 minute per question may seem a lot, but it's not. I mean, here you're getting less than 1 minute per question. So legal questions, math questions, they end up consuming a substantial amount of time. So people who haven't given enough mocks or uh, ma- uh, who haven't devised the strategy for time and CLAT end up losing out significantly on marks, primarily because of these time consuming questions. Like even logical reasoning, they are quite time consuming depending on the question, but most of them are quite time consuming. So as a general approach, I would recommend that you uh, go through the question paper in multiple rounds. I'll explain that further in the next slide, but basically that means that you complete the entire question paper once, then do it again, then do it again, rather than going through the question paper only once. So ideally you should go to the question paper at least thrice. So each question you should have gone through 3 times. It should not be that you have just gone through the question paper once. So going through it thrice will help you maximize your marks, and we'll look at it at the next slide. Second important thing is that you should be cautious, but you should not be afraid of the negative marks. So a lot of people just don't attempt questions which were just easy scoring marks for them merely because there's a negative marking, right? Or a student just ignores the negative marking and indiscriminately attempts question, both of which are equally wrong. So as a general thumb rule, if you, my thumb rule is if you're confused between two questions, like you have a 50% chance of getting it right, you should attempt the question, right? Even if there's a negative marks, even if there's a 0.25 negative mark, you can attempt the question if you are just confused between two options. So that means you have to satisfactorily eliminate two options and then you're left with just two. So then you can attempt even if there's a negative marking. But if you have more than two viable options out of four, so if you have like three options or you're unable to eliminate any of the options, then you should not attempt those questions because they are just inviting negative marking. You should not blindly mark questions at the end of your CLAT paper when you are out of time, think hoping that you get something positive out of it. I think that's a bad practice, but I have seen a lot of people do it, that they just randomly mark whatever is left at the end of the CLAT paper. I think that's a really terrible practice and you end up losing on a lot of marks because of that. Third important thing is you should have no preconceived notions about each section. I have seen a lot of people who go to CLAT thinking legal reasoning is my strength, and then they focus on legal reasoning a lot. And so, so how well you score on a section also depends on the level of questions in those sections. So if at 1 year the legal reasoning is particularly difficult, and then you go and spend all your time attempting legal reasoning merely because you thought it was your strength, you will end up losing out on that NLU that year. So what you should do is you should have a general idea of what you're comfortable with, which subject you're comfortable with, right? That should be there, but you should not take it upon your ego to score more in one section of the paper or to put in more effort in one section of the paper. No, you should adapt to the level of questions in the paper. Maybe you hate maths, but someday I mean, in 2018, you go to give CLAT and the maths is like super easy. So then the math section becomes more scoring, and you would end up losing out on it if you keep it till the end and not go through it thinking that it's your weakness. So you should be adaptable, in the sense you should pay attention to the level of questions in the question paper, and you should also have a general idea of what subject you're comfortable with, as in which one would you prefer, or which one you don't like, you which section you can attempt with the minimum amount of anxiety. Yes, that's a better description. And fourth, and that's the general rule for any competitive exam, you can't get stuck, right? You can't get stuck. You should just attempt every question once in each round, right? You can't get stuck on a question. You can't, I mean, so if you are spending more than 1 minute on the question, you should move on, right? No matter how close to the answer you are, you should move on. One more than 1 minute on a question is a huge red flag, right? Even 1 minute is a red flag, but so if you have a lot of 1 minutes, you will end up not finishing your paper. So the thing is, you should keep your 1 minutes to a minimum, and more than 1 minute is just a strict no. Just a strict no. So now just let's look at the round approach. Well, this is my personal approach. You're free to differ, but so as per my approach, your first round should take only 30 minutes, right? So you sit down, they say start, and you go. So you should complete the paper once in 30 minutes, right? So any question which you feel is a little bit, which requires a little bit of thinking, or which you can't get simply by reading, you move on, right? That's the first round. The first round is basically to get all those obvious marks, like say GK marks, right? GK marks, then say vocabulary marks in English, or like legal GK questions in legal reasoning, or very simple logical reasoning questions, or very simple maths question. So round one is basically to build up a substantial amount of correct answers, which you know for sure are correct at the minimum amount of effort. So yes, so that's round one. So you go through round one at full speed, right? You pretend that you have only 30 minutes to solve the question paper, and then you just move on. So as long as you're confidently solving around 60 to 70 questions in round one, I wouldn't worry, right? That's a very good start to your paper, right? That's a very good start to your paper. Having in 30 minutes, you solved 50, 60 marks worth of question. I mean, 30 minutes is the upper limit. Ideally, you should get done in like 20 minutes, but you have to go through each question once. So, I mean, initially, when you do mock tests, I'd recommend you try to keep it under 20 minutes. Eventually, it'll come down as you get used to this round approach. So yes, so 30 minutes is the upper limit. So what you do is in round one is read, solve, and move on, right? You don't eliminate options. You don't try to find the answer. You don't stand and think about the answer. So even in GK, if you are confused between say one name, two names, you don't stand there and think about it. No, you just move on, right? So here you actually, after finishing round one, you have uh, you should have solved all the easy solving questions, right? All the questions which are super easy. And second, you should have marked questions which you think you can solve after, or which you can just solve after putting in a little effort, right? So those questions should be marked. It's on the question paper. Ideally, I think you are allowed to put a little tick, or even not. Even if you aren't, don't worry about it. I mean, you would remember once you come back to that question, right? You'd remember it. So round two. Okay, in round one, you should solve maths question, but only if they're super easy. Like don't start solving long, complicated arithmetic operations in round one. All right. So in round two is the basic is the round where you get an NLU from CLAT, right? So you score enough marks in round two to get an NLU, any NLU. You get any NLU after round two. That is how much you should score in round two. So round two is relatively longer than round one. It's 45 minutes. In that, in round two, you read, solve, and move on. Yes, you do the same thing, but you read the questions more thoroughly. You try to put in more effort to solve the question, right? But again, remember, you should move on if you're getting stuck on the question, but not as quickly as you did in round one. Right here, if you have a confusion between two options, you can spend like 10 seconds thinking about it. But you should wrap up round two in 45 minutes, right? So at the end of round two, you should have been able to solve at least 20, I mean 40 to 50 more questions. These are questions which were solvable but not very easily. I mean, you had to do some work. So in round two, maths, the crux and the core question, like you should attack maths and do as many as you can. Again, if there is a problem, you're getting stuck, just move on. So by round two, what would have happened is you would have read each question twice. Now you're comfortable with the format of the paper. Now you have a general idea of where the questions are, what kind of questions are, and which specific questions are you having trouble with, right? So then if you have this idea and you have solved 40 50 questions additional over round one, so round two is very successful for you. So then you can move on to round three. Now round three, you tackle those questions which you aren't able to solve, right? So in round three, ideally in round three, you should not have to read that question again, right? You should have those problem questions. You should have a really good idea of what those problem questions are, and you just need to do some thinking to find the answer, right? So if a question, again, so in round three, you start by eliminating the options, right? You don't try to answer or solve the question like you did in round one and round two. In round three, you start eliminating the options. So you quickly eliminate the options and see if you can come up with an answer, right? So if you can come up with an answer, or if you're confident of coming up with an answer, you can spend some time on those questions. So at the end of round three, I mean at the end of round two, you should not have more than 25 to 30 questions which you should focus on round three, right? So these are the questions you have already identified at the end of round two, thinking that these are the difficult questions and I can't solve them right now. I'll have to think more about it. Right? Those 10 seconds in round two per question was not enough, so I'll have to think more about it. So in round three, you go and you attack those questions head on, you eliminate options, you try to uh, get as many of those tough questions as you can, right? So CLAT 3, round 3 ensures a top NLU. Right? So this is how you go. Round 1 ensures a decent grade. Round 2 ensures an admission in any one of the NLUs. And round 3 ensures admission in the top NLU, right? So this is my round wise approach. And this is what I recommend people do in CLAT. So in round 3, you eliminate, you typically in round 3 you don't move on until you've solved the question. But again, that's a general rule. More, I mean, the overriding rule is more than 1 minute per question, you move on, right? More than 1 minute per question, you move on, irrespective of whatever. So in round three, if you're taking more than 1 minute, you still move on. That's merely because there might be other difficult questions which you can solve, which you will leave if you don't move on. So yes, this is my round wise approach. I mean, you should first implement it in mock tests, which I recommend taking like one mock every day for the last 3 to 4 months. Irrespective of your score, try to complete it in 2 hours, right? You don't have to keep an exact time, but a rough time. Try to complete it in 2 hours and try to maintain this round wise approach, and you will find your scores having improved uh, significantly, because going round wise ensures accuracy as well as speed. So your time management is on point, right? It's absolutely on point. So yes, that's the approach I'd recommend. So within the round, say in round one, what subjects do you solve first? So in round one, you should always start with GK. I don't care if it's your strength or weakness, you should always start with GK. Why? Because the minute you enter the hall, you are nervous, you don't have enough concentration, you are intimidated by people around you. So GK questions are the easiest to solve. You know them or you don't know them, you don't need any concentration. And second, there are some aspects, I mean, there may be some questions which you just forgot, right? It was just in your mind and you just forgot. So if you start with GK, you will give your mind around 2 hours to recollect what you have forgotten, right? So that way, sometimes you will have those 2 or 3 questions which just come back to you and you can solve them. So it's always best to start with GK, right? Then the second one should either be maths or English, whichever you're more comfortable with. I know some students from science background find maths to be more comfortable, so I'd suggest maths. But if you're from a humanities or commerce back, or in general, if you find English to be more comfortable, then I'd recommend English, right? So the second one should be English or maths, depending on whichever you're more comfortable with. So third should be logical reasoning, and in uh, logical reasoning, I recommend drawing pictures and all. If you have like a rough sheet to like pictorial representation, say is a table wala questions and all those kind of questions, you should, and father son question, you should just draw pictures to link logically. So that is why, so I have kept logical. Then after that you come to legal reasoning, and the reason I've kept logical reasoning over legal reasoning is, once you get into logical reasoning, you are now, your logic is tuned, right? So you can quickly filter out illogical or irrelevant stuff from the question, which is very important in legal reasoning questions, right? So if you directly start with legal reasoning, or you go to legal reasoning before logical reasoning, you will end up wasting a lot of time on facts and all the all the law you know from before, right? So you will end up getting confused and you won't be able to solve questions, and it becomes truly time taking. But if you solve it after, if you keep it like as a second last, and you solve it after logical reasoning, what will happen is that by that time you're in that exam mode, so your concentration is up. You will be able to filter out important details from the facts. You will be able to filter out important details from the principle, and you will be able to solve it logically and not by legal knowledge, which is how it's supposed to be. Even legal reasoning questions, you have to solve them very logically and not using legal knowledge, which is why I've kept legal reasoning as the fourth after logic. And finally, uh, in the first round, you can attempt the last subject which you attempt can be maths or English, whichever you find less, whichever is you're less comfortable with. Why have I kept this dreaded subject at the end is because in dreaded subjects people typically don't score well. So you will, and if you try to do that, you will end up wasting a lot of time, right? So if you have, say, a 30-minute time limit, and you reach this dreaded portion at the end of 25 minutes, a maximum amount of time you can waste on this portion is 5 minutes, right? And there's a good chance that by that time your concentration is so good, like you're so in the zone of the exam, that you're able to solve some questions from maths or English, whichever you dread more, right? So yes, this is the subject wise approach within the rounds itself, right? So there's round one. So in round one you start with GK, then you go to maths or English, whichever you're more comfortable with, then you do logical reasoning, then you do legal reasoning, then finally you do maths or English, whichever you're less comfortable with. Then you go to round two, again you start with GK, right? Then again maths or English, then logic, then legal, then again maths or English, then round three, same approach. So I mean, if you follow this approach, by the end you will first, I mean towards the end, in the last, maybe if you have time left, first of all it will maximize your scoring, it will reduce chances of errors, and it will most definitely reduce chances of you missing any question, like some easy question which you have just skipped. So if you skip it in round one, you will catch it in round two. If you skip it in round one and round two, you will most definitely catch it in round three, right? And it will just give you a good, I mean, it will give you a little bit of confidence, because in round one you'll be able to solve some, round two you will be able to solve some, round three you'll be able to solve some, rather than just getting stuck in round one over one question. And it maintains your time also really well. So this is my approach to solving CLAT, and if something additional is required, I'll make another video on it. So thank you.